Inside View. I'm your host, Joel Metzger, and joining me on this show is Tom Liberty, and he has been the leader of the group called Collective Patient Resources for about the last 6 years. Tom, welcome.
How you doing? It's good to see you.
It's good to see you too, Tom. It's been a while. I'm glad to have you back on the show, and you've worked very passionately for a very long time and dedicated a huge chunk of your life to advocating for basically patient rights. Would that be a
That's fair to say. I think the focus changed as the political climate changed. As you said, it has been 6 years. But yes, both for patient rights and cultivation rights.
And cultivation rights, and this is for medical marijuana.
Correct.
And just give me just like the 30-second overview of, and then we'll get deep into it. But for those who've never even heard of CPR or you or what you do, and then we'll go into your history a little bit.
30 seconds is rough, but I'll give it a shot. Okay. We started 6 years ago, November, with trying to create a situation in Calaveras County where state law in regards to cannabis was being honored and making it a safe place for patients. We were able to do that. And as the climate changed here in Calaveras County, we started focusing on patients having the right to cultivate their own medicine, and then moved on into patients being able to cultivate medicine for other patients who were living in situations where they were unable to cultivate their own medicine. We also have been running a program for the last 4 years called the Patron Provider Program that provides free cannabis to any terminally ill patient in the Tri-County.
And obviously, that's very high level, and we'll get into a little bit more. But for those who have never met you or seen you on this show before, just a brief overview of what brought you to Calaveras County and then led you into this passionate subject.
I've been coming to Calaveras County ever since I was a kid, since I was born in Stockton, and I was raised being brought up here by members of my family to Lake Alpine and other places through and around Calaveras County. So I've been coming up here my whole life. I moved up here about 20 years ago, and I got involved with cannabis because a family member started working with hospice. And despite my outward appearance, I did not use cannabis then, and I do not use cannabis now. But I came to learn about medical cannabis through working with hospice patients who were looking for alternative medicines other than opiates. And that's how I first became involved 6 years ago. Well, more like 8 years ago when that started.
And how would you kind of describe how the general feeling about medical marijuana and recreational marijuana has changed over the past? I mean, how long has it been since we had about 20 years now?
It's pretty hard to even go there. It's quite amazing because yes, it's been legal for 20 years, and part of Collective Patient Resources, CPR's mission, has always been to help remove the stigma associated with cannabis use and cultivation. And you wouldn't think you'd have to do that 20 years in. There are people living in Calaveras County who didn't have kids when cannabis was legalized who have grandchildren now. And I still run into people that say, but it's such a controversial subject. You've got to give people time to adjust. 20 years would seem like enough time, but I guess after 100 years of propaganda, there's a reason why it's taking 20 years. And so we're trying to do it through community service and education mostly. I really do think education is the key.
Now, I don't want to get off on a tangent too much, but why was marijuana stigmatized 100 years ago?
It was stigmatized because that's when the initial wave of the war on drugs started and the pharmaceuticals really started taking over. I think it was a home remedy. In 1900, the three most commonly prescribed medications by doctors were alcohol, opium, and cannabis, in that order. And cannabis, it really is a long story. So, I mean, it's too deep for the time we have here. Yeah. But there were some racial elements to what happened with cannabis. There were some pharmaceutical interests that suppressed cannabis. There were industrial interests that suppressed cannabis in the form of hemp, which the George Washington grew and Thomas Jefferson grew, and hemp had a long history of being grown in this country, and I think that that was a threat to certain other industrial interests, which ended. So there's a lot of reasons. And then, of course, you hit the 60s when cannabis became identified with, in a way, anti-Americanism. Cannabis became identified with spitting on soldiers and flag burning and taking other forms of drugs, and became further stigmatized. And so it continued.
So fast forward up to was it 1995? Is that when?
96 is
96?
when Proposition 215 passed.
And just quickly, what is Prop 215?
Prop 215 is a proposition that was voted on by the California voters that was intended to give citizens the right to consume and cultivate cannabis for their own medical needs, as long as their doctor deemed they had medical needs. That's kind of the short of it.
And was that something that just didn't get distributed through the media, so people didn't know, or people didn't accept it, or the local folks didn't accept it?
What happens is in politics, nobody's ever been elected on a pro-drug platform. So 215, one of the things 215 said is that the state would establish a card identification program. Well, even though the law said that, that would have required that the day after 215 passed, a politician said, let's get this program rolling. Well, they just lost the next election, because they're saying, let's get this card program for marijuana going. So that program sat there. And a private group actually was called the OCBC, the Oakland Cannabis Buyers Collective, I believe is what it stood for, was a private group that actually originally started issuing the cards. It took several years for the counties to actually get on board and begin issuing cards.
Gotcha. And so this from 1996 to when you got heavily involved, would you say that it didn't necessarily sweep the state and become as widely used as it did later in the 2000s? Or what do you think was the process of people actually starting to get the cards and starting to use it more? And then all the local counties and local governments suddenly having to tackle this issue and say, what do we want to do in our county regarding this?
It's a really complicated question. Let me try to answer the first part of it. As far as the accepted usage and how it has spread to the degree that it has, I think it's an aging population is the answer to that. Often prohibitionists and people who are afraid of cannabis point to, well, we don't want our children exposed to this. What about the kids? Well, cannabis use rates are with teenagers are at the lowest they've been. I think they peaked in 1977 or 78, when about 17% of high school students were using cannabis monthly. And that's down to about 4% now. It has not increased with the increase of the availability of legal cannabis. It's gone way down. The at-risk group for youth, or the at-risk group for use of cannabis, is actually people over the age of 55, and the numbers of people that are of elderly that are using cannabis is tripling every year, and it's because they're trying to get off of opiates and other painkillers. What was the second part of the question?
Second question was, and actually, let me change it a little bit. What led you to specifically get involved? You said involvement with hospice, and actually, was it that you saw that this medicine was actually successful in these patients? Is that what really got you?
I didn't know that it would be. I'm a bit of a libertarian by politics, so I supported Prop 215, but I did not believe that that marijuana had a medical use. I was very like, wink, wink, yeah, medical marijuana. But I supported it because I think people have a right to eat an herb or smoke an herb. I don't think a government has a right to tell people what to ingest. So I supported it for that reason. But when I saw hospice patients who there's two main benefits that I've seen in working, after years now of working with the terminally ill and this plant. And the first is, the patient being able to reduce, sometimes completely eliminate their intake of addictive opiates allows them to go to the bathroom, allows them to physically feel much better than when they take morphine, Dilaudid, whatever these addictive drugs are. The other thing that's even more powerful that I run into is families who know that their time with this dying person is limited. And when that person is loaded on these pharmaceutical drugs, they're alive, but they're not present. And the thing that I hear the most from spouses and children and family members is, thank you for giving me my father for an extra couple of months, because the person is able to take cannabis and still be present, still be emotionally present for the people around them. And everybody ends up feeling like they got some extra time. And that's one of the most powerful things about this plant, one of the most wonderful things about it.
But not everyone would see something like that and go, wow, that's really neat, and then say, I'm going to become an advocate and really give a lot of my time to this. What pushed you personally to do that?
That's a really good question. I think that personally, I've been a bit of a rescuer my whole life. The very first job I ever had, real job, 17, I was in the Air Force, and I was a psych tech, and I worked with the mentally ill. And then when I got out, for the next 30 years, I worked with adjudicated at-risk youth who, varying populations. I worked with schizophrenic populations, and I worked with gang populations. But I've just had this thing where I kind of want to minister, and I'm not trying to like pat myself on the back or say what a great guy I am. I don't think it's about being a good person. I just think different people are motivated by different things, and they get their strokes in different ways. And I've always gotten my strokes through nurturing. I think I've got I hope this doesn't sound sexist, but a bit of the female in me.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what did you do? Like, did you develop a strategy? Like, did you evaluate the current climate in Calaveras County and then go, whoa, I think that there are some things that don't really jive with my way of the interpretation of the law, and how can we change that? Or how did you kind of build the organization, and what was your first move, basically?
I think the thing that probably attracted the most attention and quote unquote put us on the map was there was a true cannabis patient, not a drug dealer, who was arrested in the county. And it was clear and he spent a couple of days in jail, and I happened to know him. And like many, many activists, most people don't become active until their own ox has been gored. And so I felt, I was very affronted that this person that I cared so much about had to spend 2 or 3 days in jail based on nothing. And so this was the beginning of the organization. We formed the organization, and the first thing we did was we went to law enforcement and asked that the medicine be returned. And initially we met with resistance. The idea was, look, you need to return this medicine because no charges were pressed against this person. So since they did nothing wrong, please give them back their medicine. And there was some initial resistance, and then we did some background work and presented case law that had already happened in other counties to the attorney of the city of Angels Camp, and ultimately they prevailed upon the department to return the medicine. And it was the first time in Calaveras County that medicine had ever been returned to a patient, and it was the first time in the history of the state of California that medicine had been returned without a court order. And so that made local news, and it also made in the cannabis loop and the internet and the social networking, it actually made national news. And so that was like the first splash. And it started to attract attention. Our early efforts were very much patient-centered and patient-focused, and starting the patron-provider program and trying to care for, there's a slang term in the industry called Granny Six Plant. And that's essentially the old person who is in a position where they're able to cultivate for themselves, and they want to safely be able to do that. And that was what we did in the beginning. As things became safe for Granny Six Plant, and it morphed, and things changed, and it got a little bit bigger, and we have essentially become, now all the patient stuff is covered. The PPP is dialed in, the care for people that need help with their gardens because they're too ill, that's all dialed in, and we became more focused on preserving the right to collectively cultivate for those who can't cultivate for themselves.
So just for those who aren't familiar with a collective, that would basically be someone who is able and capable of growing more than they need could then get a product or medicine and then kind of work with a group of people who need that and then distribute it to them? Okay.
Right, and there's many reasons why someone might not be able to grow their own medicine. They might live in the middle of a town or next to a school. They might physically be too debilitated to do it. They may have children. And though I don't have any problem with children being around a cannabis plant any more than I do a tomato plant, there's still a stigma attached to the cannabis plant. So they they may worry, oh, well, what if my children's kids come over to play and they see this, and then it becomes a thing. So, the fact of the matter is the majority of people are not in a position to be able to grow their own medicine. And the number of people that can, some of them feel an obligation to help. And now with the growing movement towards legalization, there's financial incentive also. There are people that are farming for money.
Gotcha.
Which they are allowed to do under state law.
And speaking of state law, I want to make sure that you paint the picture for our viewers that we have kind of these different views from different levels of government. We have a federal view on it, we have a state view on it, and then we often have a county view. So can you walk our viewers through that?
I can attempt it.
Okay.
From a state level, cannabis is on what's called Schedule 1. Drugs are scheduled by the federal government, Schedule 1, Schedule 2, Schedule 3. For people that are hearing this for the first time, it may come as a shock, but the federal government classifies cannabis as a Schedule 1 drug, meaning it has absolutely no medicinal value and the potential to cause great harm. It's in the same classification as LSD, also known as acid, same classification as heroin. No medicinal use. That's the federal government's stand. States are increasingly, I think we're up to, I know I should know this, but I think we're up to between 24 and 26 states that have legalized cannabis in some form or another, where it be for medicinal, recreational, or both. And then what we have going on in California right now, which is a real mess, is what I call the new prohibition. And that is their certain groups of people, prohibitionists who never supported 215 or SB 420 to begin with, have found a way to effectively overturn state law through the manipulation of local municipal code. And that trend is sweeping California. And county after county after county is banning personal cultivation and or collective cultivation, regardless of the fact of the existence of Prop 215 and Senate Bill 420. And they've been able to do it through a legal loophole that is standing up in court so far.
What is that legal loophole?
It's 215 and SB 420 did a really good job of protecting patients and providers from criminal prosecution, but they didn't say anything about land use or municipal code. And remember when you were growing up and your folks would talk to you about the letter of the law and the spirit of the law? Mm-hmm. And we were taught that the spirit of the law was really important, and that there were people who would follow the letter of the law, and they but get around the spirit of the law, and they were kind of considered to be of questionable character. Mm-hmm. That's what's happened here. SB 420 and Prop 215 are extremely clear about our rights to cultivate cannabis and use cannabis, but because they didn't say anything explicitly about land use issues, it has been discovered as of 2012 in what was called the Live Oak decision that local municipalities and city councils can come in and say, well, you know what, it's not under criminal code, it's under municipal code. We're just going to say that you're not zoned properly to cultivate cannabis, and so you just can't do it. And so far, these decisions have stood up all the way up to the Supreme Court. But from a practical perspective, it's really silly. It's like saying, well, California is going to allow gay marriage, but San Joaquin County doesn't have to recognize those marriages.
So in 2012, the first of these kind of local bans went through.
And there was the Live Oak decision and the Riverside decision were the two primary ones that are cited. And so at this time, a Board of Supervisors does have the absolute legal right, as just happened in San Joaquin County, to ban any form of cultivation anywhere that they please, regardless of the existence of 215 or SB 420.
Let's go and go through the history of how law enforcement has viewed and the government has viewed cultivation of marijuana in Calaveras. Okay. So when you first got started, how would you describe the general opinion by
Calaveras has a very interesting history in terms of cannabis, because starting in 1996, cannabis in Calaveras County was definitely not supported by law enforcement, but it was completely supported by other county officials. In fact, Calaveras County has been on the absolute cutting edge of this issue compared to any other county in the state. As early as 2000, which is only 4 years after legalization, Calaveras County appointed a commission to come up with a proactive cannabis policy. And that commission included doctors, pharmacists, cultivators, a reverend, the chief of police at that time, Bill Nuttall from ACPD, Sheriff Downham was on that commission, and they worked for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks to develop a strategy that would work for everybody, that would work for patients and law enforcement alike. And they actually did come to some conclusions, but they weren't conclusions that law enforcement was happy with. So at the end, after the decisions had been made about how cannabis was going to be handled, the sheriff's department dropped out of the conversations. And it was felt at that time that without the support of the sheriff's department, who had actually been a lot of the reason why the commission had come together to begin with, because they were asking for guidelines, they wouldn't be able to pass anything. So even though nothing got passed, it was clear that the board of supervisors and county government was very much in support of cannabis. And it's been that way throughout Calaveras County's history. In 2010, the outgoing administration in the sheriff's department attempted to ban all outdoor cultivation. And this issue went before the board of supervisors, and it was soundly just rejected across the board. We were also the only county in California to develop guidelines and rules for storefront dispensaries when we didn't even have a dispensary. One did not exist. In every other county in California, rules and regulations for dispensaries, as far as I know, have only been developed in response to dispensaries opening up. And then the city fathers say, we've got to do something about this. It's always been reactive, whereas Calaveras has been very proactive. With the election of Gary Kuntz, we finally came together as a county, and our law enforcement and our citizens and our board of supervisors, everybody appears to be working towards the same goal in the same direction with total respect for state law and an understanding of why it's important to protect state law. So it's really cool to be a member and a resident of Calaveras County. It's really something to be proud of.
I have to ask you, though, your opinion on it is certainly not shared by everyone, and I know that when I've been in Board of Supervisors meetings and kind of heard the public comment, there's definitely a contingent of folks who would say, man, we don't want any kind of marijuana being grown here. You know, we think it's dangerous. We think it's a gateway drug. Even some doctors who say, you know, we don't feel like there is a medicinal value that's really been thoroughly tested and proved that we would stand behind. We feel like there needs to be more tests, not ruling it out.
Right.
And so, you know, when you see these differing opinions, I think it's important to maybe address that for our viewers. How do you have
I think it's important to address concerns that people have. How do I put this tactfully? If I'm dealing with somebody who's just already has their mind made up and is just flat out anti-cannabis, what I find is that's usually about some kind of emotion. It's not about facts. I do think that people's concerns need to be addressed. I think that in Calaveras County, one of the things that we feel really needs addressing, that our group feels needs addressing, is, especially when it comes to cultivation, is good neighbor practices, and being a responsible neighbor and being a good neighbor. We don't think that there should be no concern. I certainly don't advocate to come from a position of state law is this and therefore it's all right and forget you, you know, if you don't agree. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that with the fact that it's been legal for 20 years, it's easy to get frustrated as, maybe not so much as an advocate, I think I've got that dog on a leash, but when you talk to cannabis patients and cannabis cultivators, their anger and frustration with having to make these same arguments over and over for something that's been legal for 20 years, you know, it's very, very frustrating. And it's especially frustrating we don't have to do this here, but statewide, when you're having to deal with law enforcement who simply do not support the laws that they're being paid to enforce. And when that was going on in, say, 2000, 4 years after legalization, you can kind of go, well, I can understand, they're making an adjustment. But now we're 20 years in, and if you're a law enforcement officer who is still trying to bust people around cannabis issues, like at this point, you're recalcitrant. I mean, you need to consider cross-training. And if you can't do the job you're being paid to do, it's not your job to advocate for laws that don't exist or to try to enforce laws that don't exist. And that's very, these things are very frustrating for cannabis patients and advocates and cultivators. So yes, there are questions that need to be answered, but it's nice if the people asking the questions are actually asking them with an open mind. And after 20 years of research and information and real studies and anecdotal, sometimes it's difficult to believe it when you're approached by somebody who starts asking these sorts of questions. I mean, if you were at the last board meeting, there were certainly no cogent arguments made against cannabis at that meeting. But that's not to say they don't exist, it's just to say they weren't made that day.
Right, and we only have 3 minutes left. I think we could do this for about 2 hours, but one thing that's key that I want to make sure we mention is that the Board of Supervisors did decide to not act on any kind of a new countywide ordinance. They're going to wait for the state to decide what to do with marijuana, so just so people know that.
Maybe by 2016, I'm sure this issue is going to be revisited.
Okay, so that was kind of a celebration for I think your efforts to let the board.
It was good. Honestly, we would have preferred to continue a dialogue and try to have something in place in 2016 that could then just be kind of tweaked locally rather than wait and have to start from scratch a year from now. Yeah. But it was certainly preferable to a ban, an all-out ban, and we are very grateful to live in Calaveras County, and a lot of gratitude towards the Board of Supervisors who really listened and really, I don't mean to be presumptuous, but I think learned an awful lot during that process. And
Tom, I hate to do this at the end of the show, but you put all this effort in, and you've been so successful in your efforts, but you are going to be I'm stepping aside as executive director, effective today, which I think is a really cool symmetry because you were the reporter when all of this finally, started, and so I wanted to tell you, even though you're no longer the reporter, share that I'm stepping down as executive director. We have chosen a new one, and the announcement of who that will be will probably be made within the next 3 weeks. And I know that the efforts will continue. You're just going to play a different role in the organization.
I'm going to continue to do the medicine part, taking the medicine to the terminally ill patients. I'll probably remain on the CPR board of directors, but I'm going to be out of the limelight. This will be my last interview like this. I'm not going to be the guy with his big mug in the picture in the paper anymore. I'm not going to be the guy talking to the reporters. I'm going to be the guy staying at home and just working.
Gotcha. Well, I want to say it's been a pleasure working with you over the years, and I think that this county and a large portion of this county owe you a debt of gratitude for all the work that you've done. So thank you,
Tom. I really appreciate that, Joel.
And thanks for joining me. I hope we can talk again, maybe not along these lines, but I hope that we can have you back at some point.
Oh, I hope so too. We can come back and talk about my new radio show on KQBM 90.7 FM, San Andreas, Sunday mornings at 11 a.m. Hot Luck Radio.
Thank you. And thank you for joining me on this edition of Inside View. I'm your host, Joel Metzger, and I hope you join me next time.